My name is Dennis Whitmore, and I am 70 years old. 4 months ago, my 34-year-old son stood in the kitchen of the house I own, the house he had lived in rent-free for the past 6 years, and told me, in a tone sharpened by frustration over a conversation about his job search that had barely lasted 5 minutes, that I needed to grow up and move out of his life, and stop hovering over every decision he made. What he didn't fully understand in that moment, and what became considerably clearer to him over the following weeks, was that the house we were both standing in belonged entirely to me, that his name had never once appeared on a single piece of paper related to that property, and that 6 weeks later a moving truck would arrive to help him relocate, not because I forced him out directly, but because I had quietly listed and sold the house out from under a living arrangement that had stopped serving either of us a very long time before that particular afternoon. If you've ever loved someone enough to give them space to grow, only to watch that space become a permanent shelter from growing at all, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about punishing my son for one angry sentence spoken in frustration. It's about what happens when patience curdles into something closer to enabling, and what it finally takes to set both people free from an arrangement that had quietly stopped working for anyone. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this situation actually resolved. I need to tell you who I was before that kitchen conversation, because otherwise, a sold house and a moving truck won't carry the weight they're actually supposed to carry. I was born in 1955 outside of Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3 children in a household where my father worked at a machine tool factory for 34 years, and my mother managed our home with the specific, unglamorous discipline that defined most working-class households of that era. I graduated high school in 1973, and rather than pursuing the college education that some of my more academically inclined classmates chose, I took an apprenticeship as an electrician, a decision that felt, at the time, like the sensible path for a young man who wanted to start earning and building a life without accumulating debt along the way. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of the career that followed, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later. I completed my apprenticeship in 1977 and spent the following 8 years working as a licensed electrician for various contractors around the Dayton area, building both my technical skill and, eventually, a specific reputation for reliability that led, in 1985, to my decision to start my own electrical contracting business rather than continuing to work for someone else. I want to be honest that this decision carried real risk, particularly given that I had, by that point, married my wife, Carol, and we had our first child, my daughter Jennifer, born the previous year. I remember, specifically, the first 2 years of that business, driving a used work truck I'd purchased with almost every dollar of savings Carol and I had accumulated, taking on smaller residential jobs that established contractors considered too minor to bother with, building a reputation one satisfied customer at a time through the specific, unglamorous consistency of showing up on schedule, doing quality work, and charging fair, transparent prices, a reputation that gradually, over those early years, began generating the kind of word-of-mouth referrals that eventually allowed me to expand beyond simply myself and my truck. I spent the following 31 years building that contracting business, starting with just myself and a single work truck, and eventually growing into a company that employed, at its peak, nearly 15 electricians serving both residential and commercial clients across the greater Dayton region. I want to be honest about the specific discipline this required, years of reinvesting profit back into equipment and training rather than drawing a larger personal salary, years of personally handling every aspect of the business, from the technical work itself to the bookkeeping, the client relationships, the specific unglamorous administrative burden that most people never see when they think about what running a small business actually requires. I remember specific stretches, particularly during the recession years of the early 1980s, and again in 2008 and 2009, when maintaining the business required considerable personal sacrifice, deferring my own salary for months at a time to ensure my employees continued receiving their full paychecks, a decision I never regretted, but that required exactly the kind of sustained discipline I would later hope, perhaps too passively, that Ryan would eventually develop in his own life. I met Carol in 1979, and we married the following year. Carol worked as a dental hygienist for most of our marriage, and together we built a life defined by the same careful discipline I'd absorbed from my own parents, saving consistently, living within our means even as the business grew more successful. Purchasing our family home in 1988, a comfortable but unremarkable four-bedroom house in a good neighborhood that we paid off entirely by 2003, 15 years ahead of the original mortgage schedule, through the same disciplined extra payment strategy I'd maintained throughout most of my adult financial life. We had 2 children, Jennifer, born in 1984, and my son Ryan, born in 1990. I want to be honest that I raised both children with a specific set of values around work and self-sufficiency, values I believed, throughout their childhoods, I was successfully instilling in both of them. Jennifer, for her part, built a genuinely independent adult life, working as a physical therapist, purchasing her own home in her late 20s, and maintaining, across her entire adult life, the kind of financial self-sufficiency that Carol and I had always hoped both our children would eventually develop. Ryan's path, I want to be honest, unfolded considerably differently, and I want to describe that path with genuine fairness rather than simple criticism, because I don't believe Ryan's struggles reflect any single obvious failure, either on his part or on ours as parents. Ryan struggled somewhat academically throughout high school, not from any lack of intelligence, but from what I recognize now, with considerably more hindsight than I possessed at the time, as a genuine difficulty finding any subject or activity that engaged him with real passion or direction. I remember, specifically, several conversations with his high school guidance counselor during his junior year, discussions about various vocational programs or trade apprenticeships that might suit him better than a traditional academic path, conversations that Ryan participated in with a kind of passive agreement that never quite translated into any sustained follow-through once the specific pressure of that particular semester had passed. He attended a local community college for 2 years following high school, without completing a degree, drifting between several different fields of study, business administration, then briefly criminal justice, then a semester of general education courses without any clear direction, before eventually taking a series of retail and warehouse jobs throughout his early 20s, none of which he maintained for more than a year or two at a time. I want to be honest that Carol and I discussed this pattern between ourselves many times during those years, generally landing on a shared belief that Ryan simply needed more time than Jennifer had needed to find his own direction, a belief that felt reasonable at the time but that, in retrospect, may have allowed both of us to avoid a more direct conversation about the specific pattern developing in front of us. Carol passed 7 years ago, following a relatively brief illness, a loss that hit our entire family hard, but that I believe hit Ryan, who was 29 at the time, with a particular intensity that, looking back, I don't think I fully appreciated in the moment. Ryan had always been closer to Carol than to me, in the specific way that sometimes happens between a mother and her younger child, the two of them sharing a particular sense of humor and an ease of conversation that Ryan and I, admittedly, never quite developed to the same degree. My own more reserved temperament, perhaps making certain kinds of emotional openness considerably harder for both of us across his entire childhood. I watched him struggle considerably in the months following her passing, losing what had been, at that point, a fairly stable position at a local warehouse, and eventually asking, about 8 months after Carol's death, whether he might move back into the family home temporarily while he got back on his feet. I want to be honest about my own thinking at the time I agreed to that arrangement. I genuinely believed, in good faith, that Ryan needed a temporary safety net during a period of acute grief and instability, and I believed, equally genuinely, that a few months of free housing while he regrouped would allow him to eventually reestablish himself considerably more solidly than he might have managed, while also juggling the specific financial pressure of independent rent. I want to be honest that this belief, reasonable as it felt at the time, turned out to be considerably more naive than I understood in the moment, given how the following 6 years actually unfolded. What I intended as a temporary arrangement of perhaps 6 months to a year gradually, almost imperceptibly, became a permanent living situation. Ryan did search for work during those early months, taking a position at a different warehouse about 4 months after moving back in, but I want to be honest that this position, like several others that followed over the subsequent years, tended to last somewhere between 8 months and a year and a half before ending, sometimes through layoffs that were genuinely outside Ryan's control, but increasingly, as the years passed, through voluntary departures Ryan described in terms that grew progressively vaguer and less convincing, complaints about difficult managers, unfair scheduling, work that simply wasn't a good fit, explanations that I initially accepted at face value but that, over time, began to feel less like genuine grievances and more like a pattern of avoiding the specific discomfort that comes with sustained, difficult effort toward any single goal. I want to describe the specific texture of those 6 years in more detail, because I think it matters to understanding how gradually this pattern actually developed, rather than appearing as any single obvious turning point. In the first 2 years, Ryan's job search efforts felt genuine, if inconsistent, and I remember feeling, during that period, real optimism that he was simply working through a difficult adjustment following his mother's death. By the 3rd and 4th years, I noticed a specific shift, longer gaps between jobs, less urgency in his search efforts during those gaps, a gradual settling into daily routines that increasingly centered around video games and streaming shows rather than any active effort toward employment or personal development. By the 5th and 6th years, I want to be honest that I had, without fully acknowledging it to myself, begun simply accepting this pattern as a fixed feature of our household rather than a temporary situation still requiring active correction. I want to be honest about my own role in allowing this pattern to continue for as long as it did. I raised concerns periodically across those 6 years. Gentle suggestions about budgeting, about setting concrete career goals, about perhaps contributing some modest amount toward household expenses, even if full rent wasn't yet feasible. Suggestions that Ryan generally received with a kind of surface agreement that rarely translated into any sustained change in behavior. I remember, specifically, a conversation around the 3-year mark when I suggested Ryan contribute even a modest $100 monthly toward utilities. A suggestion he agreed to readily in the moment, but that, within 2 months, quietly stopped happening without either of us ever directly addressing the lapse. A pattern of soft agreements followed by gradual non-compliance that I recognize now as considerably more corrosive to our relationship than any single direct confrontation would have been. I never charged Ryan rent during those 6 years, reasoning, at various points along the way, that pushing too hard might damage our relationship, particularly given the specific vulnerability I perceived in him following his mother's death. A reasoning that, I recognize now with considerably more clarity, likely reflected my own discomfort with confrontation as much as any genuine concern for Ryan's well-being. 4 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, I raised the topic again, prompted by a conversation with Jennifer who had, with genuine concern rather than any desire to create family conflict, mentioned that she'd noticed Ryan seemed to have stopped actively job searching altogether over the preceding several months, spending most of his days, as far as she could tell during her own visits, playing video games and watching television rather than engaging in any concerted effort toward employment or any other concrete goal. Jennifer had visited the house the previous weekend, dropping off some items for me, and had mentioned, with a specific worry in her voice I hadn't heard from her before regarding her brother, that Ryan's bedroom had accumulated a level of clutter and general disarray that struck her as considerably more than simple untidiness. A detail that, combined with her observations about his daily routine, prompted me to finally address the topic more directly than I had in recent months. I sat down with Ryan that evening, after dinner, in the kitchen where we'd shared countless ordinary meals across the preceding 6 years, and asked, as directly and gently as I could manage, what his actual plan was for the coming months, whether he'd been applying for positions, whether there was some specific direction he wanted to move toward that we might discuss together. I want to be honest that my tone, as best I can reconstruct it now, was genuinely concerned rather than accusatory, an attempt at the kind of conversation I probably should have initiated with considerably more directness years earlier, phrased, I believe, with real care for not making him feel attacked or judged. Ryan's response escalated far more quickly than I anticipated. He set down the coffee mug he'd been holding with more force than the gesture required, and his expression shifted, in the space of just a few seconds, from mild irritation to something considerably sharper. "Dad, why are you always on my case about this?" he said, his voice rising noticeably, loud enough that I remember glancing instinctively toward the front window, an old habit from years of caring what neighbors might overhear during any raised family conversation. "I'm 34 years old. You don't need to be tracking every single day of my life like I'm still a teenager. Honestly, I think you need to grow up and move out of my business. Stop hovering over every single decision I make like you're entitled to some kind of report every time we talk." I want to describe the specific, disorienting quality of hearing that particular phrase, "grow up and move out," directed at me, 70 years old, standing in a kitchen inside a house I had personally built the financial foundation for across 31 years of continuous, disciplined work, spoken by a 34-year-old son who had lived in that same house without paying a single dollar toward its mortgage, its utilities, or its maintenance for the preceding 6 years. I remember standing there for a long moment, absorbing the specific weight of that inversion. The son who had never once contributed financially to this household, instructing the father who had built it entirely through his own labor to somehow grow up. A phrase that, in any reasonable accounting of our actual respective circumstances, seemed to apply considerably more directly in the opposite direction. I sat there, absorbing not just the specific words but the particular inversion they represented, my own son, benefiting entirely from resources I had built through decades of discipline he had not yet demonstrated any comparable commitment to, telling me, in essence, that my legitimate concern about his direction represented some kind of immaturity on my part rather than any reasonable response to a genuinely concerning pattern. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger, though a genuine sting was certainly present. What I felt, more than anything, was a specific, clarifying recognition that whatever patient, accommodating approach I had maintained across the preceding 6 years had not simply failed to help Ryan grow, it had actively enabled him to avoid the exact kind of growth our conversation was ostensibly about, and that my own continued patience, however well-intentioned, was no longer serving either of us. I didn't argue with Ryan that evening. I simply said calmly, "I think we're done discussing this for tonight," and left the kitchen, spending the following several days in the kind of quiet, deliberate reflection that I've come to recognize, at 70 years old, as the only reliable way I actually process significant decisions. I want to be honest about the specific reasoning that led to what I eventually decided to do. I did not want to simply evict Ryan abruptly, believing, even in my genuine frustration, that he deserved both fair notice and a reasonable opportunity to establish alternative housing. But I also recognized, with a clarity that had been building for considerably longer than that single kitchen conversation suggested, that as long as the house remained available to him rent-free, no amount of gentle conversation was likely to produce the kind of genuine change in direction that Ryan, I genuinely believed, was capable of, but simply hadn't been required to pursue. I spent several evenings that week sitting alone in my own living room, thinking through the decision from every angle I could consider, weighing my genuine love for Ryan against the increasingly clear recognition that my own continued accommodation was functioning, in practice, as a kind of quiet obstacle to exactly the growth I wanted for him. I also want to be honest that selling the house carried its own genuine emotional weight for me personally, beyond whatever it meant for Ryan's situation. Carol and I had raised both our children in that house, had celebrated every major family milestone within its walls, and the decision to sell it wasn't one I arrived at lightly or purely as a strategic maneuver regarding Ryan's living arrangement. I had in fact been quietly considering downsizing for practical reasons of my own for the preceding year or so, finding the maintenance of a larger four-bedroom house increasingly more than I genuinely needed at 70 years old, living alone in a space built for a family of four. The kitchen conversation with Ryan, I recognized upon reflection, had simply accelerated a decision I likely would have made within the following year or two regardless. Giving it a specific timing and purpose it might not otherwise have carried. I contacted a real estate agent the following week, a woman I'd worked with years earlier when helping Jennifer purchase her own home, and began the process of listing the house for sale, a process I kept entirely private from Ryan during the initial weeks of preparation, believing that the specific timing and framing of that conversation deserved considerably more care than simply announcing my intentions in the heat of ongoing frustration. Once I had a genuine offer in hand, roughly 5 weeks after that kitchen conversation, I sat Ryan down again, this time with a specific, prepared explanation rather than an open-ended conversation. "Ryan," I said, "I've accepted an offer on this house. It closes in 6 weeks. I want to be clear that this isn't punishment for what you said to me a few weeks ago, though I won't pretend that conversation didn't factor into my thinking. This is about me recognizing that the current arrangement hasn't actually been helping either of us, and that 6 weeks from now, you'll need to have secured your own living arrangement." I want to describe Ryan's reaction, because it moved through several distinct phases over the following days. His initial response was genuine shock, followed by a period of what I can only describe as fairly intense anger, accusing me of abandoning him during a difficult period, of prioritizing some abstract principle over his actual, immediate well-being. He called Jennifer during this period, apparently hoping she might intervene on his behalf, and I want to be honest that Jennifer, while sympathetic to Ryan's genuine anxiety about the situation, told him plainly that she thought I was making a reasonable decision, a response that Ryan found, according to what he later told me, considerably more difficult to hear than he'd expected, having apparently assumed his sister would automatically side with him against what he still, at that point, perceived as an unreasonable action on my part. I remained calm through these conversations, repeating, in various forms, the same core message, that I loved him genuinely, that I would help him think through practical next steps, but that the house itself was no longer going to be available as an indefinite solution. I offered, specifically, to help him research apartment listings, to review his resume, to provide whatever practical guidance he needed, short of simply providing continued free housing or direct financial subsidy, an offer that Ryan initially dismissed with continued frustration, but that, within about 2 weeks, he began actually taking me up on, sitting with me one evening to revise a resume that, I noticed, hadn't been meaningfully updated in nearly 3 years. I want to be honest that the following 6 weeks were among the more difficult periods in our relationship. Ryan alternating between anger, genuine anxiety about his immediate housing situation, and, gradually, as the closing date approached and became undeniably real, a shift toward considerably more concrete action than I had witnessed from him in years. He secured a position at a logistics company within 3 weeks, considerably faster, I noted privately, than any of his previous job searches had ever moved once he'd actually needed to, a specific detail that confirmed, more clearly than any argument I could have made, exactly how much capability Ryan had been quietly holding in reserve throughout those 6 comfortable years. He found a small apartment, modest but genuinely his own, signing the lease himself, arranging his own utilities, handling the specific logistics of an independent adult life that he had, for 6 years, simply never needed to develop the muscle for. I helped him move, the same way I'd have helped any of my children move, providing my truck and my labor for the physical logistics of the day, though I made a specific, deliberate choice not to provide any direct financial contribution toward his deposit or first month's rent, believing that this particular transition needed to be entirely his own accomplishment rather than one I quietly subsidized behind the scenes. In the 4 months since that move, Ryan has maintained his position at the logistics company, and Jennifer, who speaks with him considerably more regularly than I do, has told me that he seems, by her account, genuinely more settled and purposeful than she's observed from him in years. Ryan and I have had, over these same 4 months, several conversations considerably more honest than anything we'd managed during those preceding 6 years of shared housing. Conversations where he's acknowledged, without my needing to press him on it, that the free housing had allowed him to avoid confronting exactly the kind of discomfort that eventually forced his own genuine progress. I want to describe a recent visit to his apartment, because it has stayed with me since. Ryan showed me around his small but genuinely well-maintained space. A modest one-bedroom he'd furnished carefully with a combination of second-hand and new pieces, and I noticed, on his refrigerator, a handwritten budget he'd apparently created himself, tracking his monthly income against his rent, utilities, and groceries, a level of organized financial planning I hadn't seen from him in any previous period of his adult life. He mentioned, almost shyly, that he'd started setting aside a modest amount each month into a savings account, the first sustained saving habit he'd ever maintained. "Dad," he told me, during that same visit, "I think if you'd let that arrangement keep going another 6 years, I probably would have just kept drifting. I hate that it took losing my housing to actually get serious, but I think I needed exactly that push, and I don't think you gave it to me soon enough, if I'm honest. I wish you'd done this 3 years ago instead of 6. I want to be honest about how that particular comment landed with me, a genuine mixture of vindication and regret, understanding that Ryan himself now recognized, with the clarity that comes only from the other side of genuine change, that my extended patience had likely cost him considerably more time than it had ever actually helped him. "I think you're probably right," I told him. "I let my own discomfort with confrontation guide that decision for considerably longer than it should have. I think I was protecting my own comfort as much as I was protecting yours, and I'm sorry it took as long as it did for me to recognize that clearly." Ryan has also, in these past few months, begun expressing interest in returning to some form of trade certification, mentioning, during our most recent conversation, that he'd been researching a local program for HVAC technicians. A genuinely practical, stable career path that would give him the same kind of self-sufficiency I built my own life around decades earlier. I've offered to help him think through the specific logistics of that program, though I've been careful, this time, to frame my help as guidance rather than any form of direct financial rescue, wanting the specific momentum he's built these past 4 months to remain genuinely his own. I don't tell you this story because I want credit for finally setting a firm boundary with my own son, or because I believe every parent facing a similar situation should necessarily sell their house to resolve it. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Love that consistently removes every obstacle from someone's path, however well-intentioned, can quietly rob that person of the exact resistance they need to discover their own capability. Sometimes the most genuinely loving thing you can do for someone you care about isn't to keep providing an indefinite safety net, but to trust them enough to let them fall, briefly, into the specific discomfort that finally teaches them to stand. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose patience might have quietly become an obstacle to someone else's growth, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.